My name is Johnny Kim. I'm from Los Angeles, California, and I'm a Navy SEAL and physician.
The training process for me is incredible because no day is the same.
We've been learning to fly T-38s. We've been learning to fly the robotic arm. We've been learning space station systems.
Neutral buoyancy lab.
I've watched spacewalks before. They make it look so easy, and it's an entirely different spacecraft, and learning to work within that and fighting against the pressure.
The first time that I got into the spacesuit and I slipped my hands into the gloves.
Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new, welcome to Space Defense Tech. I'm Greg Pickell and I'll be drawing on my decades of military experience to look at space developments from a defense and security perspective. And there's a lot to talk about. In our previous episodes, we discussed the emergence of SpaceX's Starship as a means of getting the DOD and its Space Force into orbit with manned maneuver assets. That's DOD lingo for spaceships. Today, we're going to look at how we might man and train the crews for those ships. We'll look at the training requirement, how many do we need, what kind of skill sets. Then we'll take a quick look at how we do that today. And spoiler alert, it's not going to work going forward. Finally, we'll look at what I'm calling the new U.S. Space Training Academy, soon to be located in Huntsville, Alabama. As soon as DOD realizes that they need a new space training academy, that is. Buckle up, our ride continues with the manning and training of the U.S. Space Navy. I mentioned in an earlier video that nothing happens in the Department of Defense without an identified requirement, and that's absolutely true. So what kind of training requirement are we looking at exactly? As I see it, there are two pieces to this puzzle: the DOD Space Force needs and SpaceX's own requirements. As you may have noticed, this partnership is a continuing theme throughout these videos for one simple reason. Virtually none of this is possible without SpaceX. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the requirements. Elon Musk has stated that colonizing Mars will require 1,000 ships, and each of them will require training not simply for the crews, but for the Mars colonists themselves. U.S. Space Force requirements will involve far fewer personnel, at least initially, and will involve different skill sets in many cases. That said, the Space Skills Common Core, as we'll call it, will involve skills needed by both military and civilian space personnel. First, let's look at the SpaceX Mars colonization training audience. Then we'll tackle the DoD piece. First thing out of the box, we will not be considering the colonist training requirements themselves, in part because we currently have no idea what those detailed requirements might be. Instead, we'll stick to the Starship crews, those folks actually needed to con the ships to their destination and back. Okay, so now for some back-of-the-envelope math. This figure shows the projected crew requirement for a civilian SpaceX ship heading for the Red Planet. The numbers here reflect the need to operate the vessel on a 24-hour basis, with personnel serving 12-hour shifts. This is a tall order. It means that those folks will serve these shifts for as long as 6 months without a significant break. The second graphic looks at the crew requirements for a USSF combat corvette. And for the purposes of this analysis, we'll assume that all of the various corvette subtypes will have substantially similar crew requirements. As this image shows, crew for the USSF combat corvette is roughly 24 personnel. The actual number is more like 72, which accounts for rotational crew requirements that you don't have on the civilian side. I should note that the first Space Wing, which lays down these 21 platforms, is available in an earlier video on the channel. So what's the total training requirement? Well, if we take the numbers in the SpaceX graphic and multiply by 1,000, we arrive at a figure of 16,000 personnel needing various types of specialized training for spaceflight. That's a really big number. The total military space requirement is much smaller, at least initially. The number here represents crews for the first Space Wing, with 21 total platforms, and with rotational crew requirements, that number comes to about 1,512 personnel. So the total training audience numbers over 17,000 crew. 17,512 to be exact. When you set that against the current astronaut throughput of 8 to 12 per year, you begin to see the magnitude of the challenge. Okay, now we know what the requirement is. The problem is we have no way to meet this need using existing astronaut training techniques and facilities. At present, training an astronaut for the space station takes at least 2 years. And as I mentioned, current throughput annually is about 8 to 12 personnel. Using our current approach, my son has figured out it would take us roughly 1,459 years to train everyone. Obviously a non-starter. The solution? Introducing the all-new the U.S. Space Force Training Academy in Huntsville, Alabama. The USSF Training Academy would be something quite new in the DOD experience, a shared public-private facility leveraging civilian investment, common civilian and military training requirements, and a common core of specialized equipment needed for operations in space. This facility would be capable of housing, feeding, equipping, educating, and training as many as several thousand military and space crew annually. As just one example, the huge, costly swim tanks for training in weightlessness could be shared by both civilian and military trainees. The cost and complexity of the new Space Training Academy makes it imperative to leverage every possible synergy. This may seem like a no-brainer, but you'll recall that the traditional approach, especially used by NASA, is to spread infrastructure over as wide an area as possible to build political support. In this case, the fact that funding for space infrastructure will come from a finite DOD pot of money means that cost-effective development is the order of the day. And that's what makes Huntsville a compelling case. Most or all of the land needed is already owned by the Army's Redstone Arsenal, reducing acquisition costs to a minimum. Redstone also happens to be the home to NASA's Von Braun Center and Payload Operations Hub. Everything going to the ISS, for example, is prepped at Redstone. On the civilian side of the coin, Huntsville is home to the U.S. Space and Rocket Center's Space Camp program, which has cycled over 400,000 young boys and girls through various types of astronaut training since its founding in 1988. In addition to sharing a fence line with Redstone and boasting a variety of capabilities needed for space crew training, the Space and Rocket Center's biggest benefit will be the pipeline and personnel offered by the center, a critical consideration given the massive numbers of needed recruits. The next point may be even more important. Cost constraints mean that development and construction of this facility cannot be handled by organizations traditionally charged with space infrastructure development. Large firms like Bechtel, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and others do critical work for the DoD and for NASA, but their developmental processes and cost controls are light years behind the SpaceX-Tesla combination. Bechtel's development of the launcher for NASA's Artemis program, as an example, is currently massively over budget, though in fairness, some of that's the government's fault. And it might not be finished until 2027, more than 4 years late. Other missteps, like Boeing's Starliner spacecraft snafu, make the point even more compelling. SpaceX, on the other hand, built its own launch tower, which also catches rockets, in Texas for roughly 1/10 the cost of Bechtel's project, taking just 18 months to complete. Perhaps the most compelling point is SpaceX's construction of its rocket mass production facility in Texas, which leverages many of the revolutionary manufacturing techniques pioneered by Tesla. Bottom line, if the USSF and SpaceX want to build out a massive space crew training facility, SpaceX is literally the only firm for the job. Now, I should note, yes, this project will require competition, as most government and NASA contracts do, but not to worry. The last time SpaceX went head-to-head with the competition for the Artemis moonlander, it underbid its competitors by over $3 billion, so they will likely get the work anyways. So we've made the case for maneuver assets in space. We've examined the military requirements, the organization of the force, and finally the training requirements involved. So far, so good. But there's more to come. Once in space, our forces will need to stay there, and landing back on U.S. soil is expensive and somewhat risky. The need for a permanent, on-orbit facility to sustain our orbital maneuver forces will quickly become apparent. In my next video, we'll take a look at yet another step in the evolution of the U.S. Space Navy, the USSF's first orbital facility. That's right, we're talking about a DoD space station.